I'm excited to be here, but to Trevor's point, I don't like being on stage. And it's even more intimidating having these panelists. Some of them who have been formative in some of my growth as a researcher, either by their works or directly giving me advice and a kick in the pants when I need it. So this is an exciting time. The way that I'm going to handle this, if it's all right, is I'm going to take some prerogative of asking you each some questions myself, based on some of what your talks were on, and then obviously I'll let you guys have a chance to ask each other questions if you want, and we'll take some questions from the audience. So one of the things that I noticed across all three talks is that there is perhaps an apparent but not necessary tension in some of what was discussed today. There was a good deal of focus on data quality issues, and how do we make sure we are measuring things with the best accuracy we can, so that we have a sense of what's really going on in the world. And then there was a sense of democratizing the research process itself, inviting more people into the process, where more voices can be heard to provide greater context and perhaps a greater application for the research afterwards, that it's hitting the real world. How do we maintain quality and invite people into the conversation at the same time? Especially when some of the quality issues we're talking about are things where we're trying to be a vanguard and push it on higher. And that's a question for all three.
I guess part of my reaction is that it depends what your research goal is. With the research that I heard Professor Wilson talking about, I think that the projects, it's essential that the projects have that community base, the community involvement and buy-in. And from what the outcomes that they're trying to achieve, that design seemed like a really good fit. And I tried to clarify that what national opinion pollsters are doing, it's a little bit different, right? And so it makes sense that we approach it differently. But I definitely think, to me, there's not when I say that we need to have greater diversity in the room designing surveys and writing questions, and to me there's no tension, like that's just overkill, so
I think you have to think about fit for purpose, right? So I have a lot of the slides I'm going to show, but one of the slides I show is like this pyramid that talks about on the air quality side. We have y'all don't know these terms, but I'll try to go through quickly. Well, the EPA monitors, we call them federal retrospective monitors. So that data is important, right? And so you have federal equivalency monitors, FEMs, not as accurate, but still can be used for regulations. Then you have sort of like more single grade sensors. So the sensors, the purple that I mentioned earlier, is more of a signal grade sensor. Say, hey, MDE, for example, in our state, we see something, come do some additional monitoring, right? So it can be signal. But it also is being used, as I said, for them to do inspections, enhanced inspections. Now, we calibrated the data by co-locating our sensors with their FRMs to address the data quality issue. So you can do a calibration, right? And so I think that fit for purpose is important. But then on the community side, I think engaging communities, as I said, they are contextual experts. So I think you need all the experts at the table. They're the experts in their own lives, right? And so you're getting both, for those of you like Bayesian, I like to say, I have general knowledge. Folks who live in communities have what we call specificatory. I hate that word, knowledge. You need that specificatory knowledge, right? And that knowledge could be, the way the forms could be quantitative, semi-quantitative, or qualitative. You can do focus groups, photo voice, mixed methods, right? So that potential is there. So the democratization process, we have everybody at the table. And I think if we don't do that, our science is not, we can't maximize our climate impact. And this last note, one of the things I like to say is, what we did science, and some people may not like this, I call it taxpayer science. You did science for the taxpayers. very different type of science. There'll be more focus, I believe, on solutions and actions, right? And so I'll stop there. I can come back on that point. But it's kind of a push against the current paradigm of how we value science and we value who's doing the science and whose knowledge counts. And that community knowledge has to count for us to be able to move forward with this. So speaking around climate change and some of these grand challenges, for those who submitted grand challenges, application on campus, those grand challenges, I'll pass it back to you.
So where I do think there is some tension, and I think it's useful to point out that there's not always tension, and that knowledge of the communities and having people at the table are key. And when I work with collaborators across Duke University in fields that I know nothing about, and when they come to me and want to get help with their surveys, the thing I say is that it requires both of us at the table, right? You have the domain expertise, and then we're going to have to think through the tensions and the trade-offs in creation of a survey working together, right? Because I can tell you what the survey best practices are, but I don't know how they necessarily fit within your particular field. And what is really important is recognition that they need to bring me to the table, right? There's a whole bunch of, at every university setting, right? There's a whole bunch of people who are the most famous expert in such and such topic, and they don't know crap about designing surveys, right? And so the importance is knowing the limits of your knowledge, and I think that applies to those of us who are doing data collection as much as it applies to the domain-specific knowledge people, that it requires multiple people at the table to make sure that you're doing those data collections in the highest way possible. Where I do see some tension within my own substantive field of political science is in like doing surveys that are a dime a dozen, where you're talking about, a Gen Pop survey, and you're talking about this is a graduate student who has a $1,000 budget and is going to do a survey, and doesn't necessarily think through the consequence. So they might have the domain knowledge, but they don't necessarily have the survey standards. And the thing that Courtney and I were just talking about was the fact that we have to think through changing the incentive structures to make sure that it's not it's a cop-out, I think, to say we just have to train people better. We need better education to say this is how you should be doing surveys and you should care about data quality. No, we have to change the incentive structures of the system so that they value quality. And I think that's one of the key challenges is thinking about the funders, right? Thinking about the journal editors, thinking of how is it that we can change the incentive structures so that these things matter.
So speaking on the incentive structure, Sunshine, let me just ask you one really quick follow-up question to that. What is the one change that you think would make the biggest difference in the incentive structure that you would advocate for now?
Well, I don't know if I can say one, because there's two immediate ones that come to mind, and I have my mic on. So one of them is journal editors. There's journal editors that don't necessarily have a background in methodological transparency, whether you're talking about data, big data, or you're talking about surveys. It doesn't really matter. That's not how we choose who's leading a journal, and so we need to somehow get the National Academy of Sciences, for instance, to come up with a set of data quality disclosure, what are the disclosure standards? And obviously APOR has worked on this some, and I always point to them as saying this to other journals and saying start there. And there's some psychology journals that have done a pretty good job of having good disclosure standards, but this is not at all consistent. And I guarantee you the people who are in other fields that work with big data that there are not sufficient standards. And I think that is one way that the science, the publication, right, can better those incentives can be matched. I think the other is is actually with taxpayer reserve, or funding, right? So that's what the National Science Foundation is supposed to be about. And I thank you, NSF. I don't know if anybody from NSF is here. They have been a great supporter of my research, and that has always come through the social and behavioral sciences, which is a tiny proportion of the budget that we have historically, that Tom Coburn and other politicians have tried to cut in the past because they don't want to fund the study of themselves. And I think that is a problem, that we don't have social scientists at the top that are helping to infiltrate the decision-making in the field that cover the big questions, that cover climate change, that cover, some of these hard science areas that have a much bigger budget, because there's so much work, and survey methodologists have sometimes made some inroads into NIH, but not nearly as much as I think that we should have, given what I think that we can bring to the table. So if we could get the NSF and NIH to kind of force those collaborations, right? Incentivize those collaborations, that I think it would serve us all.
So that brings me to my next question about collaborations, and this will be also a question for all three. There's been a long history of some high-profile calls for closer collaboration and more collaboration between academia, industry, government, nonprofit organizations, etc., who are doing work on the same topics or complementary topics. And I think all of you even referenced those in your talks. Why are these collaborations not more common? Why are we still at the stage where these are being called for instead of the standard, and not having collaborations be more the exception?
It's a great question. I'm actually working on the strategy paper for the computational social science team at Pew right now, and this topic is in there because when that team was established, the vision was, you can create partnerships with corporate America and obtain and analyze data about credit cards or different social media, whatever, like this sky was open. And then we went out and tried to do that, and all of those attempts at partnerships, basically none of them panned out. And from what I gather, the risk proposition to the companies is just not favorable. So what my colleagues and I, we come to the table and we say, hey, if you do this, your company, your product will be, discussed in a Pew Research Center publication. But I can make no promise that it's going to be discussed in a favorable light, because we're going to report whatever we find that we think is important. So I can't make any guarantees editorially. They're running a risk. They're running a risk in terms of the privacy implications of giving us the data. The specter of Cambridge Analytica is there. There's a PR risk, and there's frankly a ton of legal costs and IT costs in just having these conversations and getting all these high salary people in a room over and over again to try to work out the data, the brokerage agreements, and the privacy issues. And at the end of the day, we just have not had corporate America really buy into that proposition because the risk assessment is just not there.
Yeah, I'll just say, I'll try to be quick on this. I mentioned Acrimon in my presentation. So Acrimon is a social benefits company. So those companies that maybe want that kind of social entrepreneurship, social benefits, at least from my work, I think they are kind of emerging. And Acrimon's not like Fortune 500. I'm not sure where it is, but it's a small company. So like on the small business side, there's some opportunities for innovation and partnership there. And one of the things I'm doing with Meta, we have a partnership, a social impact, an entrepreneurship partnership, where we're actually providing seed grants to small businesses to help find solutions. Right, so it's a different approach, right? A different sort of segment of the business sector. But I think this emerging social impact entrepreneurship sector, they're using data, right? They're consumers of data, right? And so I think there's some opportunities there. I'm not sure about the bigger. I mean, Google has its own. Of course, Amazon has Bezos Earth Fund, so have some money from Bezos Earth Fund, as I mentioned for my air quality monitoring work. But also, Google now has its own environmental justice fund. So you do see the philanthropic arms of some of the large tech companies. Yellow Chair Foundation is co-founded by Yahoo. One of the co-founders of Yahoo, I have some Yellow Chair money as well. So I'm looking for Google money. Please. So I am in collaboration indirectly with the tech companies through the philanthropic arms, and I'm in direct collaboration with Africa. So what I've done for Africa is connecting them to a lot of communities so they can bring their climate monitoring, cumulative impact solution to those communities. So you do have something different. It's a different segment in the sector, but yeah, that's a positive development.
So I do think that we ought to think through what the nature of the relationships look like, and you know, I think that there was 5-10 years ago the sense that we'll just go to a company, they'll provide us their data, we're going to run some research, sometimes we'll do some field experiments or something like that, and we'll publish them up and everyone will be happy. And the barriers to that, I think, are pretty well known. I mean, oh my God, like the layers of compliance, right? When maybe Pew is easier than a university, but, you know, legal and security and IRB and just all of the intellectual property, like all of those things are daunting. Very daunting. And then I've had projects where I got, you know, for field experiments, like you get cold feet from someone where you're trying to manipulate the messaging and they're like, oh, you know, you're trying to mobilize people, so we want to mobilize everyone. I'm like, well, no, you've got to have a control group, but like they get nervous. So there are, even with nonprofits that are very committed and small, that they aren't necessarily going to have the buy-in necessarily to have the type of research design that might be necessary. But then I think like maybe we should be like stepping back a little bit and thinking about, you know, having people in the room and having conversations is super valuable, right? And so like I serve on an advisory board where I think that I'm having impact. I mean, I'm not able to publish, but it still feels like there's impact in being able to shape things. You know, having served on the Census Scientific Advisory Committee for a long time, I mean, I just learned so much that while it didn't necessarily result in the research projects that I hoped, that I think it was a fruitful collaboration. Again, I would say, like, you know, that was volunteer time, right? It's service that is not compensated within the academic structure, but that we shouldn't let that one model of collaboration that has largely been difficult to see through. Do you have an update on the ANES Facebook relationship? I'll put you on the spot next. But you know, the thing is I think that we shouldn't let that limit our vision of what collaborations look like.
I do not have an update on the ANES collaboration. I hear it's supposed to be October 2022, but I don't necessarily. I wouldn't put money on that. I'm on the other end. I'm within a company where we get approached all the time from people at academics around the world about collaborating on research. And I would say one of the biggest barriers that I see is probably very closely related to Courtney's response. That when I get asked about collaborations, I get told about how awesome this would be for basic science, for general knowledge, or some esoteric impact to society. I don't get told what is the benefit to my company for participating in this. What problem that I currently have are you going to help me solve? Because we want to do the best thing for in our case at Meta, for our users. We know there are things that can be done in better ways, and we're trying. That's why we have, you know, 1,500 plus researchers within our company trying to figure those things out. But we know we don't always have all the expertise in-house that we need. But most of the collaborations that get put before me are not about helping us make things better for our users. They're about basic science. And so help us solve problems. more internal advocates for pushing the conversation forward.
And just to jump in, just to go back to the slides, and to avoid your slide with some science, solving problems. The first one, you're talking about the overemphasis, the overinvestment of the science of knowledge production, is what you just stated.
Yep.
And all those other ones, particularly the application side, that's where you're talking about. Help me solve problems. So how can we make sure science is more problem solving? And it's a the value-added proposition. Like, it needs to be a win-win-win. I mean, win-win-win. Win for you, win for that researcher, and win for me, the community. I want to throw the users, the communities into that as well. So I appreciate you saying that because that's part of it. I mean, the work I'm doing with Meta, it's really about the problem solving and also helping out with climate communications. How do you engage social media users? How do you tap into these communities that because part of it with the climate change and governance work with Meta. So how do we really get these climate messages out to folks who are really impacted by climate change? And how can Meta be a force for good in that space?
The other thing that I think that sometimes comes up as a barrier, and that I want to service as a question to you guys in a way, is the speed at which some of these collaborations or some of this work takes place, where the investment needs to be over a continuous period of a long period of time, when, for example, tech companies are usually trying to move a lot faster, maybe not in setting up the collaborations if you're dealing with our legal, but as far as like our development cycles, our research cycles are all expedited. And I think that this is also an issue for us as social scientists, where by and large, I think that as we've been talking today about quality issues and making sure we're getting to truth, that there are a lot of groups out there and people out there who are willing to get the cheap, fast answer. And that detracts not only from our, in my opinion, from our credibility as social scientists, but also our ability to distinguish quality in the broader community. With the demand for fast, set cheap aside, with the demand for fast to be timely, how do we do good quality work? How do we pay attention to all of everything that you're talking about, but not take a year to put out the results from a survey, for example?
But I like to think, maybe I'm too optimistic, I like to think that that's one dimension where Pew Research Center, where I work, is a little bit better. I mean, we sort of exist because we can do things a little bit faster than historically they've been done in the academy. Although I would say that the academy's gotten a lot faster in the last 10 years than they used to be. So I think that there's good momentum there. But I would say one thing, when it comes to a computational social science project, part of the reason we do them slowly is because we really want to understand the data quality. We really want to understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of the data, what are the coverage problems, what are the measurement problems, sort of what's not represented there that should be. We want to understand that inside and out. And when you're dealing with a data source for the first time, that takes forever.
Let me ask you a question though on that, if you don't mind. How do you make the audience who's going to get those results value that?
We haven't figured that out yet.
Okay.
And actually, so one of the things we're grappling with our strategy, right? So Pew created a data science team in like 2015, and they were charged with producing two types of products. Just pure substantive findings, like we learned these interesting things about the US population, and then other reports that were like, here's this cool data science project, here's how we did it, here's the strengths and weaknesses of this data source. And the latter have found no audience whatsoever. Like, we spend lots of communications resources and time and production energy, and nobody reads them. And the substantive reports that we've done from our data science team are just kind of hit and miss. There's a lot that haven't found an audience, but a few of them have. We've done a few reports digging into Twitter in particular, YouTube a little bit, that have generated some interest. So we have not cracked the code. I mean, I think our takeaway is the general public and frankly the general pool of reporters, they don't care about the methodological story. But I think the reality is that there are gatekeepers at some of the better media organizations. There are gatekeepers who know, who do care and can make some of those decisions. So to the extent that there is an audience for that methodological work, you could almost count them on your two hands. In terms of like work that you're really trying to get out of the national dialogue.
Any thoughts?
We're slow. Right. I mean, this is, when I have students that go into, the academy versus into industry, I mean, this is the thing that they always kind of reflect back on. It's like, you spent years working on your dissertation, and to suddenly switch the flip the switch and say like, okay, we have to change our standards in terms, like we have to make a decision by the end of the week, and you have to, have that satisficing, and that is definitely a hard transition. And I do appreciate the fact that there have been this, and I think Q plays a special role in this kind of information environment, but there have also been some data journalists, right, who have emerged and they've absolutely shaped not just the dialogue around, in my field, elections and so on, by their kind of on-the-fly, quickly produced data analysis. They've shaped what we do, and we are oftentimes chasing their narratives and their storylines. I don't know the right answer in terms of like if that is where we should be, is, like trying to figure out what they said a year ago. I mean, frankly, not a year ago, right? I'm still scrutinizing why we got the 2020, predictions wrong, right? Like, this is years and years later that we are still grappling with what I think are questions that are just not going to necessarily have the same resonance, in the general public. And to some extent, you want that. I mean, that's why you go into academic research is to have that. So I mean, I think I recognize it as a barrier, and in fact have felt that pressure from some of the collaborations of like, what's your answer? I'm like, well, we still aren't sure if we got it right over here yet. We're not ready to say. And understand that is something that can be a barrier, but don't know the solution, actually, and even what the goal should be.
I'll just be quick. The question, so on one hand, I appreciate the question because there are a lot of issues that things that I'm dealing with. They're struggling, like looking for solutions. So having research is thrown out over, that's not useful. So it gets back to fit for purpose, this utility. So having something more nimble, agile, flexible, responsive is important. But then the other side with my community-based institutional research I mentioned before, build relationships, that stuff takes time. So you just can't slap together a project with community. You gotta get to know the family, you gotta break bread again, break bread a third time, again. And you have to think, well, you in this community can work together. I mean, it takes a lot of work building relationships with partnerships. So it's interesting on that side, because once you build relationships with partnerships, I have partnerships as much as does with community groups for 5, 10, 15, some of 20 years. Because it's work that's the issues that didn't happen overnight, right? But they do need when things are happening. They do need quick research. And because the media is out there, right? They need to get the policymakers need information. You have to get them stuff that they can use. So, yeah.
And with that, I think I'm going to give you three an opportunity to ask each other a question, if you have them. If you don't, we'll open up to the audience.
I'm trying to ask you a question. You've talked a lot about data linkage, and from a design perspective, setting the project up for success if you're going to ultimately run the data. I'd love to hear like an example. What does that look like? What does it look like to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the examples that come to my mind, are my graduate students who come in and they're going to do a survey, and maybe it's going to be an expensive survey. They're going to use YouGov instead of doing it on Intern, right? And the type of things that I say to them is like, you're going to want to include zip code, right? So that you can map in census data. Make sure that you ask your questions in a way that match to how it's being collected by the Census Bureau, or how it's in whatever kind of external data that you might want to bring to bear, because the harmonization that you have to do comes at a cost, right? And so if you can bake it into the design in the first place, in some cases it means asking consent. And so, that is something that, depending on the case, sometimes means asking, are you allowed to follow up, so that you can deep dive into, and so, that's not necessarily data linkage exactly as conceptualized with, bringing together like administrative records. But it's just thinking, so what I tell people, when they have this idea, is to stop, take a minute, to think ahead about what other sources of data out there might help to answer not just that one individual research question, but possible extensions of that. And then to think about what would need to be included in the survey to be able to best make use of that external data. And
If I feel like I do a question. So you see that you're the success story on this panel of working with corporate America and having projects really take off and have impact. So can you say, and so you've solved Curtis's challenge, right, of like articulating, as a researcher, articulating the value proposition that's going to make sense from the corporate perspective, like, explaining how you're going to solve the problem that the organization cares about. So if you could just say more about how you've been able to do that, how you've been able to get to that when working with companies.
I'm new to it, so I'm not like a sage yet, but I think part of it is just really understanding, who the users for the various corporations. So going back to that Ackerman example, and I did my commercial earlier, but it is true that the world's leader in mobile-based air quality monitoring. And so I have access to communities across the country. They want to get their product out to those communities that are dealing with these issues. And recently Ackerman has signed an agreement with the governor of New York to do mobile-based monitoring as part of one of their climate acts. So they're going to be doing the work to do the monitoring to inform the implementation of their climate bill that just passed. Right? That's huge, right? And so I have connections in the state of New York, but they already have community groups already. With other parts of the country, I'm connected with communities in the Deep South, in the Southeast, connected to communities in the Southwest. I'm connected to communities in the Midwest. That's because of my research, but also my networks. And so I think that's part of the win-win-win, because I have the social infrastructure that they can engage, and also I have credibility, so I'm trusted by the community partners. Now, sometimes I have to mess up that makeup because when you're working with communities, but I think that's what I bring to the table as an asset, and also as a translator. I can translate between the different partners too. Translate with corporations, translate with communities, translate with politics. That's one of at least one skill set. I have other skill sets, but that's one of my main skill sets, to be able to translate and be a node. So I think being that node is what is valuable to the partners, colleagues at Meta, and also folks in Acma, and some other groups we're trying to build with on the social impact entrepreneurship.
Great.
I love that it's all soft skills and it's like nothing to do with coding.
But my little ones, just as a side note, they're doing Scratch and all they're coding. So I cannot code as well as they can. So coding is a great skill. I think coding is going to be the skill just like basic writing. So I think that's a great thing.
Okay, since we do have these three distinguished guests up here, I want to make sure the audience has a chance to ask a few questions. So, is there anyone from the audience who would like to ask a question? Frauke is acting as Oprah. Don't be shy.
I guess this question is specifically for Courtney. I heard you were doing some studies on the 2016 election, is that correct?
That's true.
Good. So this question is specifically about the presidential election. What do you think went wrong with the polls?
This year.
Let's do 2020, because one of the questions I was going to ask at the end is how right will the 2022 polls be?
Okay. I think the most direct answer is that response rates are low to surveys, right? We know that. When I entered the field back in like 2000, yes, response rates were declining, but whether you took a survey or not was like orthogonal to your political views. It was not strongly correlated with your politics. And in 2016 and in 2020, whether your willingness to take a survey was related to your political views. So Democrats these days, it's a little unclear if it's going to pan out this fall, but in 2016 and 2020, Democrats were significantly more likely to agree to take surveys than Republicans. We can talk about why that's the case. There's sort of a correlate with education. There's also rhetoric, the Trump administration had a strong view of polling. They shared it with their followers, and if you say a field like polling is corrupt, people are going to believe them and stop taking polls. So I think fundamentally that's why the polls had a systematic bias in 2016 and 2020. And for me, the frustrating thing was people like Sunshine and me, we've actually known that the polls have this risk, but there was we thought that we could kind of protect ourselves. We thought that we could fix it with statistics. That if we knew enough about the sample and the population, we had the right variables, that we could statistically adjust away that bias. And looking back on 2016, when I looked at the data, it looked to me that if more pollsters had gotten education correct and really fixed their sample with respect to the education distribution, didn't have way too many college grads influencing their estimates. If they fixed that, then they would have trued up their data, and that would have gone better. And we thought, well, okay, heading into 2020, if they just get that right, maybe that would fix it. But that wasn't enough. I think that's part of the story, and getting education right helps, but it's not enough. Because there's some scholarship that's come out recently that made it very clear that it's sort of like a problem within the Republican side. Some Republicans are willing to take surveys, but those who are not very good proxies for those who don't take surveys at all. The ones who are willing to take surveys are more moderate, more likely to vote for somebody like Joe Biden. So looking to the midterm, nobody knows for sure. There are some things that make me hopeful. From a polling perspective, after 2016, a lot of people like me thought with this simple weighting solution, maybe we could fix it. After 2020, the industry reaction for my seat was very different. Because when 2020 happened, then you had 2 elections where you had the same problem. So it's not just one sort of data point. You've got 2. 2's not a ton, but it just made it more, there's a more striking signal to the field that we have to change what we're doing. This is not working. And so in the months after 2020, I heard colleagues in the field being like, you know what, we're scrapping the way we do polling. We're going to fundamentally change our methodology. We're going to use a different sampling frame. We're going to use different modes. So if you look at national polling organizations, some of them have really changed their methods. not after 2016, but after 2020. And so I don't think that that will really manifest much in the midterm because the national pollsters don't poll much at the state level, but for 2024, I think that'll be a more meaningful change. So the other thing to keep in mind with the midterms is that Donald Trump won't be on the ballot. And in 2018, the last midterm, he was not on the ballot, and the polls did reasonably well. We didn't have a really pronounced bias. So there is some thought that this bias that we have of Republicans being less likely to participate is really pronounced during elections where Donald Trump was involved. He's got a strong point of view about voting. So probably too long-winded of an answer. But.
And I can't help but jump into. Just because, as a political scientist, this is just what we spend so much time thinking about. And in a lot of respects, I guess I would just add a couple of things. One is that I hate it that our field is measured on the basis of these election predictions. And I think this, that thinking about what the incentives are in the media and so on, I get where it's coming from. But I think it's damaging to the entire industry, and so it's one of those things that doing pre-election polling is so much harder than just doing a good survey, because the fundamental scientific basis of a probability sample is you draw a random sample from a population, and then you can generalize from that sample to the population with this margin of error. But we don't know the population. We don't know who's going to turn out to vote. And so this is not just an issue of, getting Republicans to respond more. What I fear in what I'm seeing some of the movement within the polling industry is that essentially that it's going to be more modeling of expectations about what the population is that is going to be on election day. And so this kind of does go back to, even though, it's not just election polling, this issue of transparency, that if the model is going to be doing more of the work in the elections moving forward, by God, we need to know that. We need to know, right? We need sunlight on that purpose of sampling and the modeling that's being done. So, you've probably heard discussions of, do you wait on party ID? And, but that is, kind of a simplified version of, we need to know if the pollsters are waiting on party ID. I mean, is the simplified version.
Yeah.
Well, I think Sunshine has the right answer. The right answer is we don't know who's going to vote. So public opinion polls like the big football scores. They're a lot of fun, but not very useful. Most of my Democratic friends went to sleep 2020 convinced Trump had won. I looked at NBC's post-election polls. I didn't tell you what the results were. I looked at the males were, what the females were. You could average them and see that Biden won every close state. So the polls would have been great if they knew who voted, but they didn't know who voted until after the fact. Okay, that's how I want to talk. I want to talk about who's interested in that information.
Hold it this way to you. Yeah.
Who's interested in that information? There are a lot of people interested in that information. We know that. I knew when I worked in the economic director that Census Bureau that our clients of EPA, and people came to us and they asked us thorough questions about everything we did, so they were really interested in documentation. Another important thing to know is that if you don't have that documentation, somebody's going to come by after the fact and say, oh, you guys know what you're doing, you consider blah, 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 blah. We consider blah, 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 blah. Okay. But the real point I want to make is that social surveys and health surveys should be more like economic surveys. In that economic surveys change their answers when they find out more information. And that's, I'm working with Samson now on the national survey of revenues and health. I'm trying to convince them that we better change the 2021 survey when we get the 2022 survey to make them look more alike. And we shouldn't be afraid of changing our answers. So if we get more information, we can change our answers. Okay? Of course, the public realize that the answer's lying. we're basically kind of more information.
But I agree with you, especially on the latter point. I think that there's a real resistance to updating, prior data, because, we have data points conflicting and people will be confused and scared, and I think we have to get past that. And I think the economists are leading the way, so I agree with you on that. On the documentation point, I don't think I expressed myself well. There's a difference between documenting how you conducted a study versus taking the time to write a report to a general audience and claiming that your methodology is new and interesting and here's why. I think you always have to do the documentation piece. So I didn't mean to suggest that we or anybody should skip documentation. In fact, we were founders, we're part of the founding set of people who joined the TI. We always have very detailed documentation for every survey, every project. But the question is, do we invest the professional resources in writing reports and calling, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal and saying, hey, we've got a new study out about this computer science project we did. Like, they just hang up, they don't care. So that's what I'm saying. We've learned that just doesn't work. And we need to sort of, go back to the drawing board and figure out how to make progress on that. But the documentation piece is always an obligation.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think I was here, and thank you so much for this really great day of interesting information from everyone. I was thinking about Professor Wilson talk about how trust takes so long to build. And, thinking about how to apply that to some of the problems we face all the time, and the inequality that both brought up. And so the general trend I tend to see in the industry is actually more towards do it yourself, more towards sample aggregators, more towards, we have one shot to get a person, we really don't know what their background is, and hopefully we can connect it to other kinds of data. And it feels like a direct competition to the idea of building trust, knowing about a person over time, building up information about them. And so I'm wondering, how do you see this trend playing out in moving away from longitudinal panels, moving away from necessarily people knowing things about people over time and the panelists? How is that going to address or ruin the inequality over time?
Well, I think there's a lot there to react to. I would agree with the overall point that I think a lot of the data sources, a lot of the online opt-in panels, the participants are not treated well, right? The measurements can be cruddy, it can be a very bad experience. And so I think we shouldn't be shocked that some of the data we get from the sources is not very good. At the end of the day, you get what you pay for, right? And but it's tough because if you're an academic and just starting out, you don't have the resources to do anything else. And so when I talk about these things, I try not to just make blanket statements about you should always do this and never do that because the world's much more complicated. But I would just second your point that how we treat people matters and whether they trust us matters. And there's a lot of practices right now that erode trust with respondents.
The one thing that I would just add, and I do think that this might not have been the point of your comment, that longitudinal studies can be really valuable. But they're also very expensive. They're expensive not only because, if you're going to invest this, following somebody over time, then you're probably talking about a baseline, higher quality, bigger investment. And if you try and do a longitudinal study with a non-probability panel, you just lose so many people, right? Because you're talking about a population that is used to not being invested in by the researcher, and so it's just nearly impossible to have a decent, panel design if you actually look at, what your attrition rates are and such. And so it takes a lot of money. And this is again where I think that researchers should make the pitch to, the bosses at Pew, make the pitch to the NSF, make the pitch to, the organizations that there is some real value. And I mean, when we think about our understanding of 2016 and 2020, some of the best understanding we got was actually from panel data, where we can say like, okay, maybe this doesn't generalize, but we know that these people who voted for Trump in 2016, this is what they were doing, so that you still have some, I think, like Courtney, I do have this view that we have to be comfortable with extracting value from imperfect data, right? Like, rather than the starting point being that we must do everything gold standard, I think rather it's just we have to both be transparent about what assumptions that we're making, but also learn how to better extract some value. And I think longitudinal data is really valuable for that.
I also just wanted to make a quick plug for also qualitative methods to come alongside to help us understand the nature of the numbers that we're getting. I know I'm a quant, and the people in the room from my company are probably like, what the world is these things? But yes, like how you interpret the numbers is the understanding of the role that you bring to them, and that has to also be involved. And quality can really help with that when it's complementary.
I think that's a really great point that I want to, also, and I think one of the things that has happened with the ease of data collection in the last decade or 2 decades or however long it's been going on now, is that what I see young researchers doing is thinking that, oh, we have to do, what I can do is do a survey that's going to be this empiric study, and then it turns out to be junk, they don't find the support for their hypothesis, and they actually don't even know that much at the end, right? And I would much rather them be able to go and do a deep dive in the community, and they're going to learn more and be a better scholar at the end of that process. And so my new training is to steer people away and to point them towards big data, point them towards observational research rather than doing a bunch of crappy surveys.
I want to go ahead and have our last audience question.
What an honor. So I guess the question that I've been trying to think about and trying to articulate is that when we think about some of the issues that we've talked about in survey research, a lot of the issues with diversity is the answer is coverage, right? We're trying to bring more people in. Let's include these populations. Let's oversample. And I was really thinking for Professor Wilson, do you, from your perspective, is that sort of framing of the problem and that solution, would you frame it differently? Would you think about it differently, from the thinking about community-based research? I guess what would hold that? Right? Is there a different approach to the problem that your research and your perspective might or?
I think it's, we're talking about, different areas of research, right? But I think the question about representation is important. And representatives is important, right? And so for, I think I was going to chime in the last question. I lost the point, I'm sorry. But I'm trying to connect the 2 points. But when you're doing communication research, it helps out with the young researchers. It helps you develop better questions, right? You get better questions. And you might talk about potential experts. They think, for example, I was going to say, the mapping tool I showed, we actually I have to submit like NIH, I finally got a really good score. I was hoping it was going to go to the study section, I go fund it, I might have to do a revision. But fund the project. The project is, we're going to do EJ School 3.0. And we're going to have all these participant feedback loops in the new tool, where we're gonna have we're at a climate change indicator, a climate change domain, a new health domain, a segregation domain. But we're gonna have statistical analysis that we're gonna have statistical outputs, and then ask, okay, here are the indicators. Now that we do this, looking at autocorrelation to these variables. Here are the indicators that are in the end that we're gonna keep Do you think we should keep these? Is this what you're really experiencing? And so, and then rank them. Well, we like these. I think the stats line up, but this is not right because I got this one in my house and that's one of my neighborhood. This is going on right. And so that type of we're going to build it into a proposal, like every step for these new domains, and build up the tool. And so that's the thing that I think there's real value in doing that. And I think y'all were speaking to that about that engagement and why these stakeholders are really important to help shape the surveys or help shape the science. So I just think putting them, like that community voice as much as possible should be one of our, these are like your 10 rules, right, of doing great research, making sure that the stakeholders are fully engaged and those voices are heard as much as possible. It's going to be the thing to make the science better.
If it's all right, I'm going to weigh in on this question as well. I love the question. I love the question so much. I do think it is a problem that we refer to these things almost exclusively as coverage error. Because what underlies the concept of coverage error and the way that we typically talk about it as social science researchers is that we're trying to get a better average estimate. And what we really need to pay a lot more attention to is heterogeneous effects. That is, disparate experiences and impacts. And when you're just talking about oversampling in order to do this, right, you're not bringing in the language that I care how different people are experiencing things. And so if we can, the same methods still apply, like you can still do the same practices and things like that. But if we can reframe the importance towards I care how different people are experiencing things, that will lead to additional insights, additional expectations around analysis, and all these things that I think are so important. And frankly, sitting in industry, where I have a lot of people developing ML models for various reasons, for various inferences to try to improve overall user experiences on things related to the company I work for, it is so hard to get data scientists to understand that there might be populations that are not having a positive experience just because the overall average number is moving up. And that we have to do something for them as well. And so the less we talk about coverage error as just a source of error for the overall estimate, even though like getting that correct is super important, and the more we talk about the reason coverage error is important is so we can understand different experiences, the better we will be.
I love this as a closing comment, you know, I mean, what a motto for this discussion is that we care about how different people experience things. So thank you all for that. A big round of applause. Julie didn't only do a fantastic job organizing this whole thing, but she also organized a little Maryland gift bag for you. In home. I really do want to thank you all for making this day such a we have. This is not the end, but we have some closing remarks from Stanley, who will come up with a moment here. And then I do want to invite everybody to hang out a little bit more, discuss a little further what you've heard here, but also look at the posters that people submitted outside. And it's still too cold outside, maybe the posters can be moved into the nice podium, but anyway, I hope to chat with some of you. And there, and Stanley, why don't you?
While Stanley's coming up, like I said, they've been formidable in my development as a researcher, so I'm super happy to sit up here with you guys. Thank you.
So this has really been, in a way, the most cohesive conference I've ever been to. I mean, I didn't expect this to work out, because I had no idea what I was going to say, because I was just asked to say something to wrap up. But it really did seem to me that these
us in very different ways. But it seemed to me that there was one theme. I mean, there were many things they said, but there was a particular theme throughout. I mean, let me just touch, back on the sunshine very early this morning. It seems like a long time ago, a lot has happened, but it's really been a terrific couple of great presentations. And she started out by talking about our need for new frameworks, methods, and tools, future investment, surveys and social science, and she emphasized, the frameworks, the change, new approaches. And then Sacoby came and told us that essentially we need to incorporate historically underrepresented groups in science, and not just as a social justice demand, but as a way to improve the science that we're doing. And then Courtney, gave us a nice overview of the importance of better represented subgroups in the population, whether we think in a sample or be able to describe what's going on in the population. And it seems to me that the core idea that underlies all of this is the importance of essentially new perspectives, right? And that's not an old idea. If we think about science, what we know, we read about Thomas Hume from Structuring Scientific Revolutions, 40 years, 50 years ago. What's the idea in that book? Well, how does science make progress? Well, all of a sudden we begin to realize that much of what we know isn't so. It's because we made assumptions, and we've taken the assumptions for granted. And somebody comes along and says, not necessarily one person, but the growing sense that maybe some of these assumptions that we made are wrong. Why don't we rethink the assumptions? And that's how science often makes progress. And that idea seems to me to really knit together what both of these presenters talked about. And in fact, if we think about the future, maybe we go back and think about the past. And if we do that, let's go back to the beginnings, really, of modern day cities. Let's go back to the 30s. And I think about Paul Lazarsfeld. I hope the name most of you know, but I hear that actually some of the younger people might not know. Was a giant in our world of conservative methodology. But how many of you know, probably fair number, but probably not all of you know that Lazarsfeld took seriously these ideas about perspectives and going out into the real world and then reaching out to the then say matter. Is the name Frank Stanton ring a bell? He was my childhood. He was the president of CBS, and then actually at some point I think he had to be the chair of the board of CBS. And in the 30s, he was on the Curtis's level in the corporation, and he and Lazarsfeld collaborated. And that was very important in the development of our field. I mean, they created actually something called, I'm pretty sure it was called the Lazarsfeld-Stanton Program Analyzer. And this was the very first attempt to try to understand how people were responding to mass media in a scientific way. They had people do this, I guess, with TV, focus groups, like because I've seen this now in the debates, in presidential debates, where you keep counts of people, and they sit there and something's getting said, and press a button. Well, this is just a technological update of essentially what Lazarsfeld invented. But this is just one of the collaborations that Lazarsfeld did. He took very seriously the idea of dealing with real-world problems of corporations, trying to solve problems of corporations with the funding. But in doing so, he actually revolutionized the nature of civil methodology. We're not going to go read some of these papers. The art of asking why. The controversy between open and closed questions. I mean, it's a controversy between law and negotiation. And these are just two of numerous things that we trace back to the last story. But the important thing there really had to do with not seeking voices outside of whatever our science might have been. So one way to do this is Curtis is taken very seriously, and is essential for us to make progress, is to confront ourselves with the real world problems that corporations have. And that, in the past, was shown can help us in science, not simply as, I assume CPS was more successful as a result, but from my, more provincial point of view, this lattice belt, moved us along as a discipline. But it's also, so that's one instance, but we also need to incorporate historically underrepresented groups, because it's not simply social justice, it's that they make the science better. Because they question it, all of a sudden, and that's what we need to do. We need to constantly, it's hard to do that, to question the things that we've learned in school, but by incorporating new parts of the population, we bring in people who are going to help us make progress scientifically. And then, let me give you an example of the importance of different kinds of organizations. The organization that Courtney plays such an important role in now had a founder in Cobb, actually, and recognized him. Andy had the idea that maybe response rates quite as important as those of us in academia used to speak in, because in the academic world, not so important, but even when Courtney first came in, she said 20 or 25 years ago, we were doing a whole lot of that idea of 3% response rate. At that point in time, it sounded strange. But when I first came in, we were feeling at 80%, 75%. But when Andy founded the organization, came to Central, in order to do the kind of work that could be done quickly, and you couldn't get and he did that, and he over time had a sense that some of us in academia kind of look down, and why do things after all, we really get 75%, well, today we get, maybe, we're getting half of it. Okay, so that's today 2% doesn't sound too bad, but for those of us in academia, years ago, pretty well. So Andy had the idea that, maybe we were wrong. We all assumed that getting a high response rate was just, had to be essential. If you got a low response rate, you weren't doing a good job. So Andy challenged us. It was only because Andy decided to say, well, maybe we can do some scientific research, and Scott Peter at that point was, or he had improved it to be it, it wasn't true.
Sort of the time period that was too much.
It was Pew, yeah, at that point it was. And he asked Bob Rose and me to come to him, and so to make a long story short, we did some work, and we did an experiment. And we did an exact same survey. And we wanted we should get a very high response rate. Relative to response rate, another we got a much lower response rate. And we didn't make any moves. Well, Bob and I didn't believe it. I'm sure Andy wasn't surprised at all. I'm not sure. I think Scott also probably less surprised, but he was working with it. And Bob and I challenged us. So each went off and did some work, which began to show doesn't mean that the projects are never important, but there are lots of variables for which, when you have a good probability sample, the nature of this project is not going to produce much. Well, what's the lesson? The lesson here is, it was challenging this decision. And that's essential for making progress. Our future, measuring the civil and social science business, depends on a willingness to challenge all the stuff that we think we know. And the right way to do this, because this is hard to do, right? I mean, you all have to assume certain kinds of things. But by bringing new people in, by bringing new voices in, not just in terms of historically unrepresented groups, but bringing new voices in the corporate world, and kind of going back to that situation, last couple of routinely working with people in corporate. And in what Pew does, by saying we have to produce results that are understandable by the public, which is what most of us in academia are not doing. We're fighting for each other. And so Pew is, is really, vital for us as kind of a reason to show us how we do these kind of things. But they can also kind of, they can come to us, it's not that Pew has all of it, but Pew brings a perspective that is really invaluable to help us move along. So anyway, that's my brief attempt to, too long, I'm sure, to try to say, this has been, I think I want to thank all of you, because I had no idea it's going to be at all police, I have no idea really what people are going to say. But I really do think we're turning to the type that you've given us, some more important way of thinking about the future of measurement and surveys of social science and how we can help it. So, thank you all.
Certainly, like to call to action to challenge our assumptions. I want to remind everybody, particularly the graduate students and postdocs here, but also potential industry collaborators that don't get their research funded within the company to check out that Peace Grant opportunity. And maybe just talk around the first set of ideas as we look for the posters. And before we go on to do that, I do also want to thank all the folks here in the tech side and the cameraman and the facilities who try to make us warm but fail. That is too part of the scientific or otherwise process, so thank you all, and thank you all for coming.